Hello, and welcome back to 100 Yards of Football, Sports Talk Radio. I'm your producer, Jeremiah Long, and joining me to talk about the man himself, Scott Case, but also some really interesting news coming through that we really want to stop and pause on in a moment. But first, before that, let me introduce the host with the most, the man who started it all, and our incredible amazing second host who brings us twice as much football information. It's almost overloaded with information. That's what we do here at 100 Yards of Football. But without further ado, let me bring in the man himself, Mr. Football, Vincent Turner, and an incredible legend in his own right, one of the most incredibly decorated football professionals that we have ever had here on the show, Mr. Harper LaBelle. How's it going, guys?
Hey, how you doing today, Mr. Jeremiah Long?
I'm great. Ready to talk about some incredible football, but I also know that there's some news that came across, so I want to turn it over to y'all now and hear a little bit more about what we're thinking about what's happening in the breaking news regarding football right now.
If you like the video this morning, please comment and share it. We'll surely appreciate here on 100 Yards of Football. Our legend video today is going to be about Scott Case, former Atlanta Falcon by way of the University of Oklahoma. So if you like the video, please comment and share it. I'm your host, Vincent Turner. As Mr. Jeremiah Long just stated, we got one of the most talented guys throughout the market here in Atlanta, Georgia, played in the league for numerous years, Colorado State grad, super talented. Mr. Harper LaBelle will be joining me. So if you like the video, please comment and share it. Before we get started today, we lost a tremendous NFL veteran running back that played on the 1972 Miami Dolphins team that went undefeated, the only undefeated team in the National Football League, Mr. Mercury Morris. And the one point I want to bring about Mr. Mercury Morris is I remember I'm 8 years old, October the 12th, 1968. I'm in the third grade. I was a big Memphis State football fan. And I remember Jack Eaton, who's the sports director and also the voice of Memphis State, talked about West Texas State, but he talked about a running back out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his name was Mercury Morris. Even though Memphis State won that game that night, they beat West Texas State 42-21, but Mercury Morris had over 100 yards that evening. And another tidbit, Dwayne Thomas was his blocking fullback, former Dallas Cowboys great. But let me pass it over to my man, who played in the league for a long time with the Atlanta Falcons. Mr. Harper LaBelle, tell us what you really remember about Mercury Morris and how did he impact you being an NFL player?
Well, Eugene Edward Mercury Morris was one of those flashing bright lights in an era where football was still played with 3 yards in a cloud of dust. What I remember is seeing pictures of him, and we have one, where he's all taped up. He's got tape on his socks. He's got tape around his wrists. He's got different colored sweatbands. But he was the flash in an offense that was otherwise sizzle. And it was right up the middle with Larry Zonka. It was right up the middle with Jim Kick. And then you can take the ball outside with Mercury Morris, and he can get around the edge. He ended up retiring with about 4,100 yards. He ended up with 35 touchdowns, 31 of those on the ground, but he had 12 touchdowns in this year right here, the Super Bowl. This is Super Bowl 8, where they beat the Minnesota Vikings. Super Bowl 7 was Perfectville. That was the undefeated season where they defeated the Washington Redskins. The year before that, Super Bowl 6, that's where he gets in the ball game. Doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. Didn't even have a carry. He had 4 returns for about 95 yards. So about 23, 24 yards a carry. He didn't have an impact, but he got to get to the Super Bowl. And the next year, he was a big component of why they were able to win. They go the first year in Super Bowl 6, they lose, and then they win 2 others. And he was on an expansion team in 1967. He wasn't drafted till 69, but that was not really a place where you would want to go. But Don Shula came in and found usage for a guy like Mercury Morris. Speed on the outside, speed in the return game, speed in everything that he did when you drop off a little pass from Greasy. So I'll remember him always as being the guy that was a flashy player in an era where there wasn't a whole lot of flash. He helped introduce that. He wasn't Deion Sanders, but he did have good numbers. He didn't have great ones, but he was a very good football player. He was one that you would want on your team. The other thing I remember, and real quick, Vincent, every year that the last and final team in the NFL lost, Mercury Morris was holding up some champagne with some of his teammates and celebrating the fact that once again they were going to have an undefeated season, and they're the only ones in the history of the league to be able to do that. I love the fact that that took place, even though all these other teams and the New England Patriots were in the Super Bowl playing, and if they had won, they would be able to share in that victory with the only other undefeated team. But Mercury was one of those great guys that really was wonderful for the league. He was a proponent of it. And I don't know his family life, but I remember him for the flash and for the sizzle and for all the great things that he did for the National Football League.
My final thought about Mercury Morris, as you just mentioned him and just referred to him, Eugene, is that think about the 1972 season. Jim Kick was in the backfield starting with Larry Zonka, but Coach Schuler said, you know what, I got to get some speed on the field, as you just mentioned, Harper. And Eugene Mercury Morris and Larry Zonka became the first two backs ever in NFL history to go over 1,000 yards. And the Dolphins gone to a perfect 17-0 season. The only undefeated team down there in South Beach in Miami, the Miami Dolphins. Kudos and much blessings to his family. And we're going to miss an outstanding football player. Now, to our legend today, Mr. Scott Case, Boomer Sooner, your teammate with the Atlanta Falcons. I'm going to turn it over to you to Mr. Harper LaBelle and tell us what made this Scott Case an NFL legend and also a college football legend.
Well, yeah, coming from the University of Oklahoma and playing with some of those great teams, when we had a chance to visit with Scott a couple months ago, that was really an insight for me about playing at a university that was in the upper echelon. There's 132 teams right now playing college football, but when you're in the top 5, top 10, and you're in one that was always in that, different level, completely different. And Scott was a part of that, but a very humble individual. I got to room with him for 2 years. So I get to know a little bit about him, his family, his wife, his kids, what he likes to do in his free time. And my one story with Scott, and there are several, is I'm running a little post route in practice. And Chris Miller was our quarterback. And I don't normally run with the ones, but this is just, we're live. But this is just a part of practice where I got to be the tight end. I run a little seam route up the middle of the field. At about 10 yards, I noticed the linebacker disappeared, and the ball was in the air as I separated between me and the linebacker. And I put my hands up to catch it. And as soon as I get the ball, boom, kapow, Scott hits me right under my shoulders in the ribs. And two things cross my mind. One is don't drop the ball. Two is this hurts a lot more than I thought. And in that split second where I catch the ball and I feel I'm getting hit, I know I'm going down. And I'm going shoulder first. My legs were already way up in the air. His impact hurt tremendously. And then I knew when I hit the ground, it was going to hurt even more. And again, this happens in an instant. And instead of standing over me and doing whatever, Scott just got up and he walked away like that was my job. That's what he was there to do. Separate a receiver from the football. So I felt it firsthand. This guy can play. And he's not the biggest guy you're ever going to see, but he was plenty big. He wasn't the heaviest or fastest guy, but he was heavy and he was fast. Was he one of the best hitters of all time? You better believe it. And he would sacrifice his body in order to try to do that one job that I just mentioned, to separate a player and he from the ball. And he did a great job in a secondary that with Deion Sanders, with Brian Jordan, with other safeties and other cornerbacks that were around, that you knew that he was reliable. He was dependable. He was a guy that was going to do his job the best that he possibly could. So most of those teams, with the exception of 2, didn't go to the playoffs when he was there. But what a difference he made in the defense. And he did so in Dallas when they won the Super Bowl there. If Larry Brown had not had those 2 interceptions, Scott Case might have been the MVP of that game because he was a guy in the middle of the field that made a difference against the Pittsburgh Steelers that day.
One thing I'm going to think about when I hear Scott Case's name mentioned, I always go on the teams you played and the talent that you played against. I'm going to go back to his days coming from Edmond, Oklahoma, then to the JUCO he went to in Northeast Oklahoma. Think about all the players that he followed that played in that program, the JUCO program. Jeremy Shockley, Ernest Givens, Pat Williams, legendary Tony Peters. So that's smoke right there. Then he goes to Oklahoma. And this is what really separates me, calling him an NFL legend or college football legend. Think about this, Harper. Think about what he went against in practice at that time in the mid-'80s doing y'all time. And he had to play safety, and look who he was tackling. Marcus Dupree, Chet Winters, Danny Bradley, Derek Shepard, Earl Johnson, Spencer Tillman. That's unreal, man. That's 4x100 meter speed. And you just mentioned Oklahoma being one of the top 5 programs ever. He comes from JUCO and starting and facing it. Think about that. That's the top of the cream. And then his ability when he made the 1988 Pro Bowl, think about all the players that's on that Pro Bowl roster that made it with him in the secondary. Legendary Kenny Easley, Ronnie Lott, Darrell Green, Jerry Gray, a real serious football player out of Michigan, Keith Bostic. That tells me that's what I consider greatness. And the one favorite skill set that I'm going to remember in my final words about Scott Case today, we all talk about it. See, I grew up in the 80s like Mr. LaBelle, and we talk about this all the time. Old school safety that will hit you, and you will be feared to come over into the middle. Back to you, Harper.
Yeah, real quick, one thing about his athleticism. Scott was a quarterback in high school. Scott had pretty good hands. We look at all the interceptions that he had. And one other thing, he was a quarterback for a while. Yes, a cornerback. They moved him to safety later on in his career. So he was covering all those guys, the wide receivers that you mentioned at Oklahoma, but he also did it in the NFL at the highest level. So between safety, which is where he settled in, and that's where I think he made his name and fortune for himself, if you will. That's a guy that played 2 different positions on defense that could do so at the level that you need him to be a dependable, reliable, and a force. That speaks volumes to me as well. And to make the Pro Bowl, but to be one of those guys that you threw it in that area, he's going to hit you, or he can pick it off and take it the other way. So a lot of great things about Scott that I remember in terms of his athleticism as a football player. But in the day of days, back when I was playing, he'd be called a beast because he was one of those guys that just did his job over the middle of the field, as you mentioned, Vincent. So great player, honor to be a teammate of his, and glad we get to talk about him on the Legends portion of our show.
If you like the video, one more time, please come in and share it. I'd like to give special thanks, honor, and praise to our producer today, Mr. Jeremiah Long, for making us look good today. Thank you, sir. Also, to all the audience here at 100 Yards Football, and I'm going to make a major announcement that's been on my heart for a long time before we leave today. We at 100 Yards Football would like to thank this man on the screen for becoming part of the team, because what he's done for 100 Yards of Football in just 1 month, the numbers going up. People are reacting. The very talented Mr. Harper LaBelle coming to us from Colorado State University, the beautiful city out in LA, Hollywood. My final words today, Scott Case. One thing I remember about him, hard-nosed, old school safety. And a guy that put his body on the line. Boomer, sooner. Dun, 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 dun. Thank y'all.